Um, I have got the pleasure of introducing my good friend, Susi Miller, and I've been a friend of TLDC for probably about 4 years now. And when I found out that Louise was putting on this event, I just knew that Susi needed to be involved. So I met Susi. We're both members of the eLearning Network, which is a not-for-profit organisation. And Susi was doing a webinar on accessibility, and I was just hooked. I was mesmerised by what she was sharing, and I just knew that I had to do better. There's lots to learn, and I'm taking small steps, but I think those small steps make a difference, hopefully. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce you to my good friend and author of Designing Accessible Learning Content, Susi Miller.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me and for that lovely introduction, Jane. So I just wanted to thank everyone really for attending today, for giving up your extremely valuable time to find out more about e-learning accessibility and also some of the myths associated with it. So let's begin by going through our agenda for the session this morning. So we're going to start by having a look at a definition of accessibility, and that's because it can have so many different meanings in an e-learning context. Next, I'll go through the 10 most common myths about e-learning accessibility, and I'll also be giving you a few takeaways as we go through. So hopefully you'll find that helpful, particularly if you find that you're needing to advocate for inclusive learning content. We'll then have a final key takeaway, and to finish, we'll have some time for a Q&A session. So as I said, we'll start by looking at exactly what we mean by accessibility. And I often find that when I use the term accessibility in an e-learning context, that people misunderstand me. And that's because they think that I'm using it in the sense of either something that's easily obtained or used, or either something that's easily understood. So although it can have those meanings, for the purpose of what we're discussing today and for this presentation, what we mean by accessibility is, I think, best defined by the W3C, so that's the World Wide Web Consortium. And they say that accessibility means that people with disabilities can equally perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with content. And it also means that they can contribute equally without barriers. And I think one of the key words to be aware of in this definition, the reason that I like it so much, is this word barriers. And that's because unless we develop learning which is accessible, what we're doing is actually preventing people from achieving their full potential. So if we create barriers in learning by not making it accessible, we're actually limiting people's ability to learn and therefore succeed in our education system, in our workplace, and ultimately even in society. So while I think that many people are aware of barriers that we can create when we're creating our learning, for example, if we don't put alternative text onto images or captions on videos, for example, for me, it's almost more important to be aware of the many barriers which stop designers and developers actually engaging with accessibility in the first place. And I think those are the many myths, the assumptions, the misconceptions, which I still think are surprisingly common today. And these are the myths that we're going to be looking at this morning. So hopefully by the end of the presentation, I'll be able to convince even the most skeptical people that making learning content accessible is the right thing to do, and that is also achievable. So we'll start now by looking in more depth at these myths, and really they're just based on the most common things which I hear from clients at conferences, in discussions, or I see on social media. Now, throughout the session today, I'm going to be asking you some questions, and there's no need to put your answers in the chat. I really just want to get you thinking. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to think about is to guess what you think is the most common myth which prevents e-learning professionals from engaging with accessibility, just to see if you agree with me. So in my experience, the myth that I probably encounter most often is that accessibility isn't worth doing because it only benefits a niche audience. Now, if you do any research into statistics about disability in different countries, you'll probably find a wide range of different information. And this can be due to the definitions of disability used or the way that the data is collected or interpreted. So that's why I tend to stick to the broad range of statistics that's offered by accessibility experts. And they say that in most Western countries, the size of the disabled population ranges from 12% to 26% of the overall population. And globally, most people agree that it's about 15%. Having said that, statistics in the US are very clear. So according to the CDC, 61 million adults, or 26% of the population, have some type of disability. Now, while those statistics alone might not be enough to persuade everyone of the importance of accessibility, sometimes I think the economics helps. So the spending power of households with at least one disabled person is $490 billion in the US and $8 trillion worldwide. So this brings us on to our first key takeaway of the session, and that comes from Neil Milliken, who's Global Head of Accessibility at Atos, and it's the best counter-argument that I've heard to this myth. And what he says is 1.3 billion disabled people worldwide is not a niche, it's a demographic megatrend, which I hope you'll agree is a great quote to have to hand whenever anyone suggests that disability is a niche. So our next myth is the one where people say things like, oh, we don't need to make e-learning accessible. We don't have any disabled people in our workforce. Or it could equally be students in our institution. But since so much of what we do does focus on workplace learning, we'll have a go at addressing this one in the workforce. And this brings us to our next question. And again, no need to answer in the chat, just have a guess yourself. What percentage of the US workforce do you think is disabled? Now, I actually found it quite difficult to get accurate, up-to-date figures to answer this, but an accepted approximation is from, we've got 8%, 12%, 15%. And as I say, an accepted value is about 12%. So in the UK, it was actually easier to get statistics, and it's about 13%. So another key thing to be aware of is it's really likely that these figures are a significant underestimate, and that's due to two things really: undisclosed and undiagnosed disability. So a recent study in the US concluded that only about 39% of employees with disabilities have disclosed this to their manager and 21% to HR. And if you add to this the large numbers of people who haven't had a formal diagnosis, which often applies to people who have neurodiverse conditions such as dyslexia or ADHD, then your percentages go up even further. And the final factor to be aware of when it comes to workplace disability is that whether through things like depression or chronic stress, cancer or back pain, some workers become disabled at work. In fact, according to Microlink, 1 in 4 people who become disabled do so whilst they're actually in work. So although we can't be sure of the exact figures, I think it's safe to say that making our workplace learning inaccessible excludes more than 1 in 10 of our audience. And is that really what we want for our compulsory compliance training, or our health and safety courses, or our staff development programs? Our next myth is about the range of disabilities which are catered for by accessible learning content. And a misconception that I've encountered many times is that accessibility is only important for people with visual impairments. And I think this is a really important one to tackle, because without having an understanding of the range of disabilities which are covered by accessibility, it's impossible to understand the types of things you need to do to make your learning accessible. So to tackle this myth, we'll start by looking at the 4 categories, which for ease we divide digital accessibility into. And those are vision, hearing, motor, and cognitive. And of course, these are very artificially neat categories, but just for our purposes, it's a useful starting point. Now, in a moment, I'm going to ask you to start thinking again. But before I do that, I just want you to focus on the icon that we have for motor impairments, which is a mouse icon. So that's just to sort of remind you that in the digital context, when we're thinking about a motor impairment, we're thinking about dexterity issues, which make it difficult or sometimes impossible for learners to interact with content using a mouse. And instead, they use a range of assistive technologies, but very often a keyboard. So now that we've established those 4 categories, I'm just going to pause for a little while and ask you to think of a person who has a disability or an impairment. It could be yourself, it could be a colleague, it could be a customer or a client, it could be a friend, a family member, or even someone famous. Now I want you to think of which of the 4 categories their disability or impairment would fall under. And now I'm going to ask you to see if you can think of one example for each of the other categories. Again, just pause for a couple of seconds so you can have a think. Now I'm just going to run through some of the examples of things that people have given me in the past. So for vision, we have blindness, colour blindness, low vision, glaucoma, cataracts, and diabetic retinopathy. Some specific categories there. Some specific, so the kind of general, and then some specific conditions that people quite often give. For hearing, we have deafness, hearing loss, acoustic trauma, auditory processing disorder, and then we have for motor, loss or damage of limbs, arthritis, multiple sclerosis, repetitive strain injury, cerebral palsy, and Parkinson's, all very common examples that come up. For cognitive, a very broad range we have here. So we can have learning disabilities such as Down syndrome. We can have neurodiverse conditions, dyslexia, ADHD, ASD. Then we have some conditions affected by movement and flashing content such as epilepsy and vestibular disorder. And then we can also have a whole range of mental health issues such as depression. So I hope that's a great start in helping you to be more aware of the different types of disabilities, impairments, which benefit from accessible learning, and also for tackling that myth that accessibility only benefits people with visual impairments. So now that we've discovered the different types of disability and who it benefits, it's time to tackle an associated myth, which is that accessibility only benefits people with permanent disabilities. So although some disabled people find it really frustrating, and that's very understandable, that accessibility needs to be justified by widening the scope to temporary and situational impairments, I do think it's valuable to consider, because it changes the focus for quite a lot of people away from an us versus them mentality, more to thinking it's just us thinking, really. So the idea, in other words, is that accessibility benefits everyone. So to look at this in closer detail, I'm going to start by having a look at temporary impairments. So just have a few seconds now to think about some impairments that people could have temporarily, which would make it difficult or impossible to interact with digital content. So the picture on the screen might give you a clue as to a temporary motor impairment. So we have a motor impairment due to an injured hand or wrist. We could also have a visual impairment due to eye surgery, hearing impairment due to head cold, and a cognitive impairment due to stress and anxiety. And now we'll move on to situational impairments. So interestingly, when I used to cover this on training, I found that people often found it much more difficult to think of situational rather than temporary impairments. But I think the impact of COVID-19 has changed that. So let's look at some examples of situational impairments, which we might be more aware of now as a result of working at home during the pandemic. So again, we have a picture which is an example of a motor impairment. So using a laptop whilst holding a sleeping child is a good example. For visual impairment, we could have using old equipment or slow broadband, which won't allow you to download images. For hearing impairment, we can have sharing a kitchen table with someone on a Zoom call, certainly an experience that I've had. And then for cognitive impairment, learning in a noisy and distracting home environment. So I think considering temporary and situational impairments is a really useful strategy in showing how accessibility can benefit all of our learners. So nearly halfway there now. Our next myth is the one that says accessibility is only important for federal departments and agencies. Now, it's true that due to legislation such as Section 508, accessibility is more important in federal organisations, but it's also worth knowing, and it's certainly something that I wasn't aware of before, that it's also extended to other types of organisations through state laws, institutional laws, and also grant requirements. And it's also worth knowing that even though you may think that accessibility is only important for federal agencies, your competitors don't agree with you. So we have two quotes now from the industry perspectives, which come from my book, Designing Accessible Learning Content. And the first is from a leading content provider. What they say is that there is now a noticeable increase in awareness in accessibility in procurement procedures across the board, with many potential customers now actively seeking out information about our accessibility credentials. And the second is from an authoring tool provider, and they say that although inclusive design may have been overlooked in the past, it is now so fundamental to the diversity and inclusion agenda of so many organisations that providing learning content which is not accessible to all learners is no longer an option. And continuing our focus on authoring tool providers, I think it's beginning to become increasingly common to see them focus on the accessibility features of their tools because they recognise it's good for business and for extending their market reach. And I've also recently seen evidence of accessibility being a unique selling point for learning management systems and also for virtual events platforms. So I think the key takeaway is that your competitors have already realised that making their products and services accessible enhances their brand and increases their market share and profits beyond just a focus on federal departments and agencies. Now, the next myth that we're going to tackle shifts us to thinking more about the learning content itself. And this one goes something like, you can't use images or videos in accessible e-learning. And I think this myth has mainly come about because of our reliance for many years on providing an accessible alternative for our e-learning courses. And in most cases, this has been a Word or a PDF document, which typically contains only the text of the course. And it's designed to be an alternative for people who use assistive technology, most often screen reader users being the main target audience. Now, a couple of years ago at a learning technologies conference in London, there was a talk from the people from the Nobly authoring tool, and I discovered a really useful visual way of demonstrating the result of this approach. So this first image of a standard Rubik's Cube, it has all of its squares in the bright colours that we're familiar with, and that represents a standard e-learning course not designed for accessibility. And the second image shows the accessible alternative. So it's been adapted so that each of the squares has its colour indicated in Braille, so that it's accessible for a non-visual user. But the crucial point here is that all of the squares are now white, and that makes it a really poor experience for someone who is visual. And that's exactly what happens when we strip out any visual engagement or video content from our courses in order to make them accessible. But it doesn't have to be that way. So we can use as many images as we like, as long as we add alternative text to any which add meaning, so that the description can be voiced by a screen reader. And we have similar devices that we can add to video resources to make them accessible. So we can use videos as long as we add captions so that they are accessible for people who have hearing impairments. This depends on the functionality of the authoring tool that you're using, but some tools do have captioning tools within them, and others allow you to upload a caption file. And another option is to embed videos which have captions added to them. So, for example, captions are automatically added to videos in YouTube, but a really important point to remember is that they always need to be edited to correct them for any errors and to also add punctuation. If your videos contain important visual content, it's also important that you add audio description, which describes this for learners with visual impairments. And another option, which is highly recommended by accessibility experts, is to add a transcript. And this is because it benefits a huge range of learners, including people who simply prefer reading to watching videos, people with cognitive impairments who may find it difficult to process moving images, people with dyslexia who benefit from having the text and being able to change the colour and the spacing to make it easier to process the information, and deaf-blind people who can only access the content of the video if you provide a descriptive transcript which they can interpret using Braille display. And so here's our key takeaway for this myth. Making e-learning accessible doesn't harm the learning experience. It enhances the experience for everyone. It adds alternative ways of accessing the content, which caters for a whole range of different experiences and preferences. In other words, it provides multiple ways of accessing the content. So just like a Rubik's Cube, which has colour and texture, it caters for a wider audience and it provides a richer learning experience for everyone. So now let's focus a bit more on some of the myths which surround the sort of nuts and bolts of creating accessible learning content. Myth number 7 is a common complaint that I hear from designers and developers. And it is, we can't make e-learning accessible because we don't have the right authoring tool. So let's explore now how authoring tools can make it easier for us to create accessible learning content. And we'll start with a true or false question for you. So the question is, there are guidelines to help providers make their authoring tools accessible. Do you think that's true or false? So the answer is true. You may be surprised to find that there are actually guidelines to help providers make their authoring tools accessible. So just like WCAG, they are produced by W3C. They are known as the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines, or ATAG, whereas WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And they were first released in 2015. But unlike WCAG, these guidelines are not a legal obligation. They're just good practice and guidance. So ATAG has a whole series of very detailed recommendations. But at its heart, its aim is to, first of all, make tools themselves accessible for developers. Then to make sure that tools allow developers to actually create accessible content. And thirdly, to support developers to make content accessible. So the ATAG then give us the benchmark as to what authoring tool providers should be doing to make it easier for us to produce accessible learning content. Having assessed many authoring tools in the research I did for my book, I don't believe there is this magic one tool that has got it exactly right yet, but I think they're certainly getting better. But even so, if we come back to our Rubik's Cube analogy again, there are certainly some tools which make the experience of designing accessible learning content feel like this. And some can even make it feel like this. So even more difficult. But let's have a look now at the positives. Let's have a look at some of the things that e-learning tool providers can do to make it easier to create accessible learning content. So the first, and I would argue the most important, is an up-to-date conformance statement or voluntary product accessibility template, or VPAT, which is aligned to WCAG 2.1 levels A and AA. So best practice examples also have tool-specific instructions which tell you how to use your tool to meet the level, which is the legal standard now in many countries. Another best practice is to provide good additional supporting guidance, which gives you more information about making your content accessible. So this example gives more detail about which of the tool's layouts can be used to best accommodate different types of impairments. Another good feature is built-in accessibility functionalities, such as automatic accessible alternative activities. And this example shows an accessible multiple choice version of a drag and drop interaction, which appears automatically. Accessibility checkers are also very helpful, as are very clearly labeled WCAG compliant themes. And a final example is to have accessibility built into the workflow so that it doesn't feel like a chore or something additional that you have to do. The information is just there as you're designing and developing your content. So I hope you agree that there are some great examples of best practice accessibility features already available in tools, and I'm very hopeful that they'll become standard in every tool at some point in the future. So now moving on to our next myth, and this is the one that says accessible e-learning can't be engaging or interactive, another very common one. It's very similar, I think, to our myth about accessible e-learning not being able to be visually engaging. And it falls into the category of what I call the either or dilemma. So this is the idea that e-learning can either be interactive or it can be accessible. It can be innovative or it can be accessible. It can be beautifully designed or it can be accessible. Lots of variations on that theme. And I actually think that this misconception is probably the single most damaging to the reputation of accessible e-learning. And it's the reason why so many e-learning professionals don't engage with it. So let's start our exploration of this myth with one final question for you to think about. So do you know which interactivity in your authoring tool is accessible? So, of course, there's no right or wrong answer to this question, but it's worth knowing that many tools now offer interactive activities which are accessible. This is a great example from the H5P tool, which offers overview information in one really handy place on all its content types, and it details whether they're accessible or not. Other tools may not have such an easy to access list, but they certainly do have interactive activities which are accessible. So for example, some have drop-down alternatives for matching and sequencing drag and drops, which are keyboard and screen reader accessible. Other interactivity which is commonly accessible includes true or false questions, multiple choice and multiple response activities. And the key point is that if a tool has interactivity which is accessible, this also provides the opportunity for content authors to be creative and innovative. So this is an example of a quiz which I've created using the tool Storyline, and it shows how taking a multiple response activity and combining it with images and motion paths can mimic a drag and drop interaction and yet still be fully keyboard and screen reader accessible. Now, I think it's worth sharing that this example comes from a fully accessible course which was shortlisted for the best non-profit and public sector project in the Learning Technologies Awards. And I say that not, I promise, because I want to prove what a great instructional designer I am, but because it's the best argument to counteract the myth that I have that accessible e-learning can't be engaging or interactive. So if authoring tools are getting better accessibility, is there something else which is still holding it back from becoming the default in learning content? And I'd say our two last myths are the big part of the reason for this. And the first of these, number 9 in our list, is that we don't have the time or the budget to make e-learning accessible. Now, while I think it's important to be clear that accessibility does take commitment and it does take extra time, particularly when people are new to it, there are many strategies which can help organizations to make accessibility less time consuming and costly. So we don't have time to go into these into a great detail. I could do a whole webinar on this, but we'll have a look at some of the key ones now. So the most important, I think, of these strategies is to make sure that accessibility is a consideration or a core requirement from the start. So as anyone who's been involved in retrofitting or shoehorning in accessibility at the end of a project knows, it's infinitely more time consuming and costly to do it this way. Other things that you consider are to streamline the process so that you're confident from the outset about the accessibility of your tool and how to work around any limitations. I'd also advise setting up accessible templates and interactions which can be reused in projects. And other things which are key are having organizational support, a leadership which recognizes the benefits of accessibility and is supportive of the extra time and resources that it will take to implement, particularly for initial training and support for content authors and developers. Now, developing a team of champions is also a really helpful strategy because it prevents accessibility from just being the speciality of one or two passionate individuals, which can often be the case. So that's a very quick whiz through some of the things you can consider. But to finish this myth, I just want to share this comment, which I saw recently on social media, and for me was a true light bulb moment. What it says was, accessibility isn't more work. You were just cutting corners before. Your work was incomplete. So yeah, a real takeaway, that one for me. And now onto our final myth, and another reason I believe so many e-learning designers and developers fail to engage with accessibility. And this is the idea that we can't make e-learning accessible because it's too difficult. And here's the thing about this myth. If you are talking about making content generally accessible, then this is something that can be achievable in many ways, quite often simple ways. But if you're talking about making your learning content compliant to legal accessibility regulations, most often, as we said, WCAG 2.1 level A, then I would have to agree that this is all too often the case. It does seem true. So just a quick look at one of the most notorious of these WCAG success criterion. They're called WCAG 1.3.1, Info and Relationships. It's a good demonstration of why this is the case. So it says, information, structure, and relationships conveyed through presentation can be programmatically determined or are available in text. Now, the main purpose of this standard is to make sure that content authors use headings and list styles and mark header rows on tables so that they're accessible to assistive technology users. But I challenge anyone who said that the WCAG explanation is clear and straightforward. So the language that's used here, it's technical, it's complicated, and it's designed for web developers. And I think that makes it very difficult for the majority of e-learning professionals to understand, which leads far too many people to give up on accessibility altogether. And this is quite typical of the language that you'll find in WCAG, including the 4 overarching core principles. So that's perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Now, I believe very few people fully understand, and they often make finding any information really time-consuming and frustrating just by grouping them into those 4 overarching principles. And that's why I wrote Designing Accessible Learning Content. I wanted to save as many content authors as possible from the hours and hours of grappling with accessibility and applying WCAG to learning content so that it became easier for everyone to do. So it's based around a contextual framework which allows you to apply WCAG in a logical order, which makes sense for designing learning content. And it also translates them into plain English with lots of examples using different tools. So that concludes our look at the top e-learning accessibility myths, and I hope it's made it possible to see the huge benefits and value of accessible e-learning. I genuinely believe that attitudes are slowly but surely changing, and that there's no longer any excuse for us not to move forward as an industry and work towards making accessible learning content the norm rather than the exception. And I believe it's the responsibility of leaders and of us at grassroots level. Because if you remember nothing at all else from this presentation, I'd like you to take away this famous quote from the user experience guru, Steve Krug. And he said, very famously, the one argument for accessibility which doesn't get made nearly often enough is how extraordinarily better it makes some people's lives. How many opportunities do we have to dramatically improve people's lives just by doing our job a little better? So I hope you found that useful, and I think now we have hopefully some time for some questions.
We do. We have some time for some questions. Let me start out with answering this question. Yes, the sessions are being recorded, and I'll be sending out a link to all of the recordings to all the registered attendees. So look out for that after the event completes. Give me a little time to sort through that stuff. Susie, people are wondering whether or not you'll have the deck available. I know it'll be part of the recording, but
yeah, I can. Yes, I can share that. Yeah, share the information. That I'll put it in an accessible format, so it's yeah, it's available to share. Yeah.
Okay.
Again, probably give me a little bit of time to do that.
Yeah. Now, folks are wondering, like I've got Jeanette Brooks. She's wondering about a live version of your accessible multiple response question that you built in Storyline.
Okay.
Is that available anywhere, or is that something that you can share?
So how it actually works. So there is, I have done another webinar about that, which has got some examples of it in action and how it started off in an inaccessible format and became accessible. So again, yes, I have got some recordings of that I can share.
Okay, great. Great. Excellent. Okay, let's see. We've got one from Samantha Curtin here. She's asking if there are resources you can recommend that provide alternatives to popular e-learning interactions that aren't accessible, like drag and drop activities.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think as I say, sometimes it comes back to what tool that you're using. So if your tool isn't telling you, I know certainly when I started working in the tool that I was using, I did a lot of testing myself to see which activities were accessible and inaccessible. I think an ideal thing to do is, depending on the authoring tool that you're using, is to maybe contact the authoring tool and ask them to give you that information. I think that's the first step that we need to take in maybe helping authoring tools to be quite accountable for their, the accessibility provision that they provide for us. I think drag and drop is one that comes up quite a lot, and I think the example that I gave there was, and in the webinar I talked about, was that the reason I decided to try and make that drag and drop accessible was it was really central to what I was trying to do in the piece of learning. But quite often I think that, we kind of tend to think that drag and drop is kind of an essential component of e-learning, but often I think there are other alternatives that you can use. So sometimes what you're trying to either test or to get someone to think about can actually be just as equally valid and equally interesting for everybody in a simple multiple choice question. So sometimes it really depends on what you're trying to do with what the reason for your question is. But yes, I think most tools now do have interactive alternatives, but sometimes it is just digging down and trying to find out which ones are accessible. And as I say, it'd be great if people sort of contacted their authoring tools and asked them to provide a handy list so that they could see which ones were immediately accessible to use.
Love it. Okay, great. All right. Trish Kelly is asking, how do you feel about, how do you pronounce it? WCAG? I heard you say,
Yeah, loads of different ways. Yes, I tend to say WCAG, but yeah,
WCAG.
People got different ways.
Good. Something new for me there. How do you feel about WCAG 2.2 and 3.0? Do you think that the world is ready for an even more elaborate standard? What do we miss by sticking with 2.1?
Yeah, I think that the great thing about WCAG is that it does develop in line with technology. So I think 2.1 was a really important upgrade because it was taking into account different upgrades in technology and developments in technology. So a lot of them focus on mobile technology. So 2.2 and 3 are kind of are quite sort of set different. 2.2 is additional requirements on top of what we have already. So I think I'm not sure if they've actually been finalised yet, but I think that we're looking at about 12 of them, and I think those are again just sort of becoming more in line with advances in technology. So I can totally understand how, we've already got WCAG 2.1, level A and double A is 50 criteria. And I think, I can't remember off the top of my head whether it's 9 or 12 new ones then come in. So it can feel, again, overwhelming when you're a content author and you're trying to grapple with yet more that you need to then be aware of. But I think that's the key thing for me, is that they are in line with advances in technology, and I think with assistive technology as well, which changes and updates all the time. So and different thinking about accessibility. So WCAG 3 is slightly different, because the idea behind WCAG 3 is that it's a complete overhaul of the regulations. And one key thing, for example, is that at the moment WCAG accessibility are pass or fail criteria. So the thinking behind WCAG 3 is more along the lines of you can have different levels of accessibility. So I think that's a great to move forward to, because I do think there is a bit of this, that's why I think accessibility sometimes is very scary, because you just think, well, I'm failing, it's not, and I think accessibility is a progression, it's a journey. And I think, if you have put so much into it and you get, well, you're failing, then that isn't overly helpful. So in some ways, I think WCAG 3 is a great step forward. And I also think that one of the key things about it is much more supposed to be a much friendlier, easy to use language, which I think is a key, something that really needs to be addressed. So I mean, I think it's in its early stages, and I think the kind of thinking, I think, in accessibility sort of expert circles is that probably that there will be a quite a long transition, and probably WCAG 3 isn't going to be widely adopted until it comes into to legislation. So there's a feeling that could take I think I've heard someone say between up to 5 years. So I'm not an expert on that, but for me that makes sense that we're at the moment we're looking at WCAG 2.1 because that's in the majority of the legislation that we need to meet. So that's our kind of benchmark that we're working to. So hopefully that answers that.
I think it does and more.
Sorry.
Thanks, Susie. One last question from Anu.
Yeah.
She's asking, you mentioned adding additional textual descriptions for visually loaded videos. Do you add these descriptions in the voiceovers, transcriptions, or in any other way?
Okay, so generally the kind of standard way that you probably notice if you it is called audio description, and you may notice that when you're watching TV. So it's quite often in the gaps between the action and the spoken. If the gaps are long enough, it's gaps in the spoken. What people are saying, sorry, and the action. Sometimes you'll see a video where it's the action is paused because that then allows people to put in the audio description describing what's happening. So that's one way of doing it. I think quite often in e-learning it's also possible to add audio description as a separate audio track, and sometimes you do see people, if people don't have an authoring tool that allows them, or an external authoring tool that allows them to add audio description to a video, you can add it as a separate audio track, and then in effect it's really like someone reading out the script. It has all of the words that are spoken, but it also has all of that description as well. So yes, it can vary how you add your visual description to videos.
Wow. All right. Well, Susie, thanks so much for doing this session.
No
really
problem.
appreciate you helping produce this event and your participation. And I think people were trying to access the website to get your book, but I don't know. We may have crashed the server because it stopped loading. Hopefully that's the case. But I will. Yeah, Rob said he's buying your book today. We're gonna. I'll make sure that a link is included to your book when I get all the recordings out. And so, but thanks again. Thanks for everything.
You're very welcome.
And really appreciate it. Hopefully, this isn't the last that we'll see you. And
it'd be great.
Good luck with your book. All right, everybody, we've got another break here, so take some time, go out into the lounge. Diane Elkins is going to be up next, and she's going to be talking like kind of a more hands-on thing with doing some accessibility with Microsoft Excel. So we'll see you in the next one. Thanks, everyone.